Hey, welcome to Two Drs Homestead. My name is Daniel. I want to talk about some terminology, the idea what is a homesteader, what is a survivalist, what is a prepper, how do they overlap, where do the ideas come from, right? And you look nowadays, and not attacking anybody with a chicken, tomato plant, and a YouTube channel can be a homesteader, and that's okay. Not here to judge, but the term used to mean something, and maybe in some cases it still does. But let's talk about what is a homesteader, right? Where does the idea come from? And it really goes back to the 1800s after the Civil War. So it was 1862, the government started the Homestead Act. And the idea was that if people were willing to go out into unsettled areas and set up a homestead, build a house, improve the land, survive, create civilization, they would get the land for free. And really, the idea of homesteading, of going out and building that land, being self-sufficient, goes back much further than that. But in terms of the term homesteader, that's really what solidified the term. And the idea, once again, is you go out and you survive, right? You build a house, you build a farm, you raise your animals, you grow your crops, and you have your family, and that family unit is able to survive more or less self-sufficiently, right? And that's the real idea behind homesteading, is self-sufficiency. Now, in the modern world, that is actually, you could argue, harder than it used to be. Maybe it's not, and we're just used to modern conveniences that didn't exist in the 1800s. But to be self-sufficient, right, to be off-grid, there certainly wasn't a grid back then, to not be dependent on the grocery store and the feed store and all of those modern conveniences. And I guess I would say it's more difficult now because everything's very expensive, right? Back in the day, you got, I think I said 160 acres for free. Good luck getting 160 acres for free now, right? Everything's very expensive. So in reality right now, being homesteader is not cheap, nor is being self-sufficient, right? So that's a certain reality. But if you go back to the 1800s, homesteaders were the original survivalists, right? And I'll talk about what a survivalist is, what a prepper is. You had to go out with your family and live and not die, right? And certainly not dying is a big part of being a survivalist and being a big part of being a prepper. You had to know how to build your house and build your cabin and build your barns and raise your animals and deal with illness when people in your family were sick and grow your crops, right? You were self-sufficient in as much as you could be, and sometimes that meant a lot, right? So you have the overlap with prepping because you had to survive hard times, right? As a homesteader, you couldn't call DoorDash or Pizza Hut and get a pizza delivered in the middle of a blizzard, right? You had to have enough food to survive the winter. So you were always prepared. You had to be prepared or you wouldn't survive. Homesteading overlaps with survivalists because, once again, you had to go out and build all this stuff, right? You couldn't just run down to Home Depot when you got on your 160 acres and start buying wood. No, you had to get an axe, right, or get a saw and start milling trees and making usable boards and log cabins and actually building things out. So you had to go in with a minimal number of tools because it was really what you could haul. Now, you probably had a wagon or two or whatever they had, depending on the situation. So they weren't necessarily just taking a knife and building a farm, but you had a very minimal access to supplies and to equipment, right? So it's about having those skills, being self-sufficient, surviving, preparing for hard times, right? So in its essence, homesteading very much overlaps with being a survivalist, with being a prepper, because you had to go out and survive. Now, modern homesteading is a little bit different because, once again, it is hard to break away. It's hard to break away from society. I mean, it's hard to break away from the internet. Here we are on YouTube. It's hard to break away from all these things and truly be self-sufficient. Now, when you look at prepping, right, the idea of being a prepper, that goes back to the early 1900s was the first time that the word prepper was used. It really didn't become popular until after, say, 2000. Maybe it was Y2K. It seems more popular lately, of course, and it has a lot of negative imagery around it. People still use the term, hey, you're a doomsday prepper, as almost a bit of an insult, right? Some do, some don't, and that's okay. Once again, though, like homesteading, the idea of being prepared goes way back, right? If you wanted to survive the winter, you had to be prepared. Once again, 100 years ago, you couldn't call Pizza Hut and have some crazy 16-year-old in an old car drive you a pizza in the middle of a blizzard in 20 minutes or less, or whatever it is now, right? You had to have food. If you want to make it through hard times, you had to have food put away. And that's really what prepping is about, is being prepared for those hard times. Now, you might say, great, it's the 1900s. I'm sorry, it's not the 1900s, right? I'm old, maybe in my mind it still is. It's 2023. So why do I need to be prepared? Because there's always some crazy kid willing to drive me a pizza in the middle of a blizzard no matter what. Well, if you look at there's an article, the surprisingly solid mathematical case of the tinfoil hat gun prepper. He uses hydrology math, which is the math they use to determine the likelihood of floods for insurance purposes. So you've probably heard the term things like 100-year flood or once-in-a-lifetime flood, and they do different math based on the frequency of occurrences and whatnot. Well, he used that math to dig into prepping and say, okay, what's the likelihood based on the history of America of something like major civil unrest or even a revolution? You look at the history of America, we had the Revolutionary War, we had the Civil War, and we haven't been around very long as a country. So just using a few major data points, he was able to determine that there's about a 37% chance in your lifetime of major nationwide violent revolution, or that works out to about 10% chance every 18 years. So you might say, hey dude, it's 2023, it's not the 1900s. Cool down, Jeremiah Johnson, if you know who he is. Daniel Boone, take off the raccoon cap. I'm just going to order a pizza. Why do I need to be prepared? It's because you don't necessarily have to prepare for the good times. You've got to prepare for the difficult times. And no 37% chance in your lifetime of something very disruptive happening on U.S. soil may not seem like a lot. It's certainly more than zero. So some people look at that and they want to be prepared in case something happens. It may not be a major event like we saw in American history with the American Civil War, with the American Revolutionary War. There's a lot of lesser things can happen, and the odds are greater than zero, right? So you see the modern prepper movement. Maybe for most people, they think it's superfluous right now. I don't need a year's worth of food. Once again, I'll just go to the grocery store, right? The grocery store is pretty reliable. It's open, most of the time. Some places it's 24/7. If I want some food, I'll just go get some food. I don't need to put rice and beans in Mylar bags for bad times. And I would say maybe not, right? You're playing the odds and you're hoping for good times. Right? I'm not going to go too much deeper into that. Statistically, once again, it's greater than zero. And you look at everything going on in the world right now, and it's much greater than zero that something unfortunate could happen where you might need to have some stuff put away. Once again, 100 years ago, prepping wasn't a thing. It was just normal life, right? So kind of going into the next item, we talked about homesteading, we talked about prepping. What about survivalist? And there's a lot of great survivalists out there, and there are a lot of great survival shows out there. You look at things like Alone, Naked and Afraid. They've got survival, they have primitive survival. Generally, the idea is you can go out into the woods or unfriendly environments, because they certainly send them all over the place, with minimal tools, or in the case of Naked and Afraid, nearly no tools, and survive, right? You hunt your food, you purify your water, you build your shelter out of what's available in the environment, and you're going to be able to live there, survive, theoretically indefinitely. And I think one of the things the shows teach us is most people probably can't, right? Even alone. Most people tap out, right? There's the one guy at the end, maybe he makes a couple months. He has his tools, he has his 10 tools, he has the things he can carry on his back, and maybe they could last longer than they did if they could tap out, but most people can't, is what we're seeing, right? The more you watch those shows, if you want to believe there's any realism behind them at all, you see the people starve and tap out. So being a survivalist is very difficult, and it's very skills-based, right? Being a survivalist is more about skills than the equipment, though generally, you're going to need some equipment, whether that's a good knife, a pot to boil water in, right? As compared to preppers who you're preparing And a lot of those preparations might be more equipment based, right? You want a year's worth of food, and you have your self-defense tools, and you have your water stored. It's more about storing and having the things you need to survive long term, assuming a break in, say, the supply chain, whatever might cause that, whether it's SHTF, zombie apocalypse, a winter storm. You're trying to be prepared to continue life, quality of life, normalcy through bad times, and that's really prepping. So there is, once again, an overlap between prepping and survival, in that preppers are also trying to survive. So I'm just using the name, the word, to define itself in that sense, right? Not necessarily every prepper is trying to learn how to start fires in a primitive way, but certainly knowing how to start a fire is a good part of being prepared, and we've talked about that before. You know, you could say prepping is 50-50 skills and stuff, right? And you could say survival is maybe 90-10 skills and stuff, right? The more skills you have, the less stuff you need, up to a point, right? There's only so many skills that can get you past not having something like a pocket knife, right? You can't skill your way past a pocket knife. Maybe you find a stone and you chisel it down to a sharp cutting tool. People do that too, right? But certainly at some point you do need some stuff to survive. A prepper is going to have more stuff than skills generally, you might say, but you can certainly be a highly skilled prepper. You could be a survivalist that prepares. And I know I'm just throwing a lot of words around, hoping it makes sense. And said, even a homesteader, right? Homesteaders were, you could say, the original preppers. You could say the original survivalists. They had to be prepared. They had to survive, right? They had to be able to go out into the woods. So I wouldn't get hung up too much on, hey, I'm a homesteader, I'm a prepper, I'm a survivalist. I would encourage anyone at this point to be prepared for hard times, whether that's financial hard times, whether that's supply chain hard times, whether that's any other kind of hard times, not just because of everything going on in the world today, and certainly that is substantial and daunting, right? Just in general, even in great times, it's good to prepare for the bad times, right? So I want to throw that out there, just kind of break it down. I see the terms mixed and matched, and you know, I know this channel, we call it Two Drs Homestead because we're out here, we've been homesteading for about 6 years, but we're starting to grind out a lot of prepper content, and I'm a second generation prepper, right? I would say my dad was a prepper, he was a survivalist, and people were preppers and survivalists before the terms came up, but a lot of the time that was just normal life. You didn't have to call it out. Nobody looked at you funny if you had food stashed away for the winter. They do now because you don't need it, and when you're doing things like that, maybe it makes people nervous with their own level of preparation, right? If you're stockpiling food, like, why would you do that? I don't have food stockpiled, we shouldn't need that. So the fact that you're doing that makes them nervous, and then they're going to come back and be like, hey, you're crazy, because they don't want to do it, they don't think it's necessary, they don't want to think it's necessary, right? So there are some negative connotations on all of that. Everyone loves the homesteaders. I got the pigs in the background, they're just chilling over there. We got the turkeys, we got the chickens. We're doing what we can to be as self-sufficient as we can within reason, right? Once again, there's modern society, mortgages and whatnot. So I hope that helps out. That was kind of on my mind. I wanted to get it out in a video. So as always, thank you for watching, and we appreciate you.